So I don't know where this is going to end up in the video because some days have passed since I did the last modification, but as you guys know, the Jeep is going through a little bit of some changes for the better. And one of the changes that I've talked about several times in the past that's bugged me a little bit is when we get fully loaded, this thing squats in the rear quite a bit. And you can see I've got the Jeep pulled in right now to start work on something else. And what am I doing to address this issue with the Jeep squatting when it's loaded? Remember, we have the 3.5-inch lift. It's the game changer from Metalcloak. And with the Jeep that's not really loaded up heavy, it works really good. In fact, it's great because then you don't have the Jeep sitting up too high, and you want the Jeep to be as low as possible, but still get the travel you want. You don't want the Jeep just jacked up in the air for no reason. But my friends at Metalcloak have hooked me up with a set of 4.5-inch springs for the rear. And so we're gonna be essentially adding 1 inch to the rear, but with the load, it's gonna come squatting back down to where hopefully the 3.5-inch would have been when the Jeep was just under its normal weight. But remember, we've got a drawer system in here. We carry a fridge, we carry a battery, we carry a roam box, we carry an awning, and some tools and a lot of stuff, plus the dogs and things like that. So we end up with a heavier load than I think most people have because we are overlanding and taking a lot of stuff with us. So today we're going to start digging into this and swapping those springs out and see if we can't get this Jeep back up. Now, interesting tidbit, for me to get in and out of my garage, I already have to let the air out of the tires to get in here. I'm only down to like 12 PSI or something like that. It's going to be really interesting after I make this change today if I can get the Jeep out of the garage. All right, so we've got the jack up on 4 jack stands. Why do we do that? When we're dealing with the rear end and we can't actually hold the Jeep in position, the front end can just roll. So I like to put the front axle on a couple of jack stands too, as you can see. And what that'll do is I jack up the rear end and I play around back here. The Jeep can't roll away from me and be in a dangerous situation. Doing this stuff in the garage is always tougher because you're actually down on the ground and not on a rack. It'd be a lot easier on a rack, but I don't have a ceiling tall enough for a rack. So a couple things we're gonna do. We'll go ahead and disconnect the track bar to let this thing really fall down. Probably don't really have to, but I'm gonna disconnect it anyway. That will allow the bushing to rest because remember, when we tighten all this stuff up, we're really going to want things sitting on the ground before we tighten things up. We'll definitely want to disconnect the shocks right now because that's essentially what prevents the axle from drooping as far as it could go. And then we will also go ahead and loosen the bolts on the control arms to let them flex as much as possible too, without really tweaking too much on the bushings in there. Once that's done, we should be able to let this axle just slop right down to full droop and pull those coil springs out. And if they won't fall out that way, we'll go ahead and go get a coil spring compressor. All right, so just a quick note, little safety precaution here when you're doing this type of stuff. You've got a connector here for your e-locker that's actually going in the differential, and you've also got a hose here, which is just a breather. So that you don't break the zip ties and things holding all this stuff together, it's always a good idea to go ahead and disconnect these things first before you let your axle droop all the way down, or you run the risk of causing a problem here with some of these devices breaking. You don't want to break one of these connectors. That would be really bad. All right, let's see if we can get this sucker to sag down far enough to get those springs out. just like that, guess what, guys? Easy peasy. All right, so remember I had 3.5-inch lift. We're going with the 4.5-inch dual rate coil spring. So swapping out the 3.5-inch spring. And what you can see here in the difference, if we line up the tops, you've got a delta of quite a bit more really than an inch. But remember, this is gonna compress. And by the way, this guy has been in there for a couple of years. So it could be sagging. Let's just say we tortured it. All right, so I am running into something interesting here on the passenger side when going with a 4.5-inch spring. And remember, we're not weighted or anything, we're sagging. And that's kind of the issue, because as the axle sags with the short arms, right? Again, we have the 3.5-inch game changer, which is the short arm kit, not the long arm kit. What happens is when we try to get this up into the coil spring perch, you'll find that when you go to push it back to line up with the axle, this coil spring, as you can see, is actually hitting the fuel tank right here. And I'm quite a ways from getting into the perch. If you look at this right here, I'm probably, I'm a ways off. I don't know what that is. It's probably a good 2 inches from getting in there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna shove this up into the coil spring perch with everything up there, lined up where it should be. I've got the bottom here lined up with where I want it here. I'm going to ask my wife to go ahead and jack this up a little bit and start compressing the spring and see if I can force it in there. Now, if I was smart, guys, I'd go to the store and get a coil spring compressor and take this effort out, but I think we might be able to pull this off. Go ahead and jack it up a little, sweetie. Keep going. Okay.
More, or is that it?
One more pump. Okay, right there. Let's see if we can put this in there. There we go. All right. Go ahead and jack one more time. There we go. One more time. Cool. All right, and I think we're in. Now, I cheated a little bit. I used some masking tape to hold that top bumper. On the Metalcloak kits, you'll find that the passenger side comes with a slightly thicker coil spring rubber bumper perch. And that's because there's more weight. So, but it looks like we've got the 4.5-inch spring in. That was a little wrestling match. I'll double check everything, make sure we're good, but I think we've got it. So quick note here, guys, that I want to make clear. I am sagging so low right now to get the spring in that these arms, as you can imagine, as this sags down, that pulls the axle forward, hence that's why the coil spring is hitting the fuel tank here. This would never happen under the normal range of motion when we've got the shocks and everything connected, because it can't sag this far with the short arm kit. There's no way, especially with the shocks and everything connected. So this is not in the normal range of motion right here that's making contact. Once we get this jacked up, shocks connected and everything, even at full droop, we're never gonna have the spring touch the fuel tank like this. All right, so now you get a good look at this. We're at full droop right now with the shocks extended as far as they can go. And as you can see, we've got quite a bit of clearance between the fuel tank and the right side spring. So yeah, we're gonna see how these 4.5-inch springs lift this back up. And right now, I'm gonna go ahead and reconnect everything. We'll get this sitting on its own weight, and we'll tighten up our control arms and all of the items. Remember, anything that has a bushing, you need to tighten up. You need to wait until the vehicle is sitting on its own weight before you tighten it. So a couple things I did do to make this a little easier on me was give myself a little slack. You know, I did disconnect the mount for the brake line so that these could flex a little more. And I did go ahead and remove the bump stop on the tops for easy access to this bolt here. So it's, again, these are the bump stops that come with the Metalcloak kit. I just removed the top one, and what that did is it gave me easy access to get a wrench back in here on the back side of that bolt, and that was very helpful. Other things that I did, as we talked about, I disconnected our electrical line for the e-locker. I disconnected the breather hose so that didn't get stretched out, and you guys saw me go ahead and disconnect the e-brake cables, which was the final piece to let it droop far enough to get these big springs in there. And that's pretty much it. So just a word to the wise. I always do this. I don't know if it's necessary, but a lot of dirt gets in kind of inside these connectors right here. I mean, let's face it, I submerge this sucker in water, stuff like that. So I like to clean these out before I put them back together, because sometimes you can't get the little release pin to release if you don't. So just something to think about, guys. So we'll push that back on and put the release back in. You also want to be sure that you're putting a new zip tie on your line here too, because the zip tie is gonna be what protects this from actually getting yanked on as it goes through its suspension travel, and we don't want it yanking on the connector. So we'll put a new zip tie on here, and that should be good, just like so. Now we're nice and snug, and going through travel isn't going to yank on this guy. Everything is pretty well snugged up. What I'll do is I'll go around now, torque everything to spec, and mark all my bolts to be sure that I can remember if they were tightened or not. By the way, I know what you guys are thinking. You're asking yourself, is Jeff wearing a poop colored onesie? No, this is not a poop colored onesie. I don't know how this happened. I just happened to have on this undershirt yesterday, and I threw these pants on today, and I didn't notice that I looked like a poop colored onesie. My bad. All right, so she's back together and squatting a little less in the rear. Now, I still feel like it's squatting a little bit, even with that 4.5-inch spring back there, but the only way it's going to get any taller than this is to go all the way to a 5.5-inch spring. So what I'm going to do, it could just be my imagination because I'm not aired up. I'm actually still aired down right now. I'm going to go ahead and air it up, and I'll measure 4 corners. I should have measured it before I started, but give me a break. I definitely put a taller spring in. You guys saw it firsthand. So I think this will help us a lot. Something I did do while I was under there is I removed one of the bunt stops. I'm gonna see how this goes. That'll give me another, well, you can see it here. It's about 1 inch of travel, up travel. And I haven't been having any issues since I addressed the control arm lengths, where I was originally having little rubbing on the pinch seam in the back. I fixed that, and I'm gonna see if I can get a little more articulation out of it by removing that bump stop. We'll see how things go. And stay tuned. We might have some more modifications as we go. There's a bunch more stuff on the list I got to take care of. Next, we've got a few more things coming, but I'll leave that as a surprise, and we'll see you guys next time.